Hey y'all, welcome back. Before we begin, I want to issue a content warning. This video contains discussions of a violent crime, including assault and murder. Viewer discretion is advised. Today we're covering the tragic case of Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student whose life was stolen in a horrific act of violence. This video will focus on the trial of Jose Ibara, the man responsible, the powerful verdict delivered in court, and the deeply emotional victim impact statements from Laken's family and friends. As always, I'm not a lawyer or a therapist. I'm just here to share this story and hopefully honor Laken's memory by making sure her story is never forgotten. The trial of Jose Ibara was intense and heartbreaking. The prosecution laid out overwhelming evidence that this wasn't a random crime.
It will come in basically three forms. There'll be forensic evidence, there will be digital evidence, and there will be video evidence. And all three forms of those evidence will point to one person, Jose Ibara, as the killer of Laken Riley.
It was premeditated. They described Ibara as a predator, someone who deliberately hunted Laken down that day.
We'll start with a timeline, and the timeline is established by a lot of the digital evidence that you're going to hear about. And for Laken, that timeline begins basically at 9:03 in the morning. At 9:03 on Thursday, February 22nd, Laken Riley did something that she does all the time, and she went out for a morning jog. She lives not far from the crime scene, and Your Honor is going to see several maps in this case, and you will see that where Laken Riley lived, where the defendant lived.
Hearing the word hunted sent chills down my spine. The evidence was damning. It included physical evidence, surveillance footage, and the horrifying details of Laken's final moments. One detail that really stuck out with me was how meticulous this prosecution was in showing the intent behind Ibara's actions. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was calculated. Y'all, I've covered a lot of cases, and every time I hear words like intentional or premeditated, it just breaks my heart even more. Laken was just out for a jog, living her life. She had no way of knowing what was coming. It's a reminder of how precious and unpredictable life can be. The defense didn't have much to stand on. Their arguments were weak at best, focusing more on trying to mitigate Ibara's sentence than proving his innocence. Thinking about the trial, I can only imagine Laken's family sitting there listening to these details. It must have been unbearable.
Judge, the evidence in this case is graphic and it's disturbing. What happened to Laken Riley is graphic and disturbing, and it is a tragedy. The loss of any life that young and apparently full of promise is a tragedy. And I'm sorry that the family is having to go through this and be here for the presentation of this. The evidence that Jose Ibara killed Laken Riley is circumstantial. You'll hear that his phone was in the area, and you'll hear that the cast team that ran the locations of this phone. And there's good evidence that the phone itself was in the area. What you'll also hear, though, is that when they looked into this phone, when they did a close examination of who was using this phone, it wasn't just Jose Ibara. It was other people in that apartment who were using this phone. And that comes through an investigation into the accounts that were used through this phone, and also from people who met other people associated with this phone who had used the phone to message people. And you'll hear that Mr. Ibara's fingerprint was on Laken Riley's phone. But you'll also hear that he was wearing gloves, supposedly. And that this hole that was supposedly in the gloves that they found would not have left that mark. And the state will ask you to consider different types of forensic evidence to suspend your understanding of how that evidence is evaluated. When they run those fingerprints through the database of fingerprints where they know Mr. Ibara's fingerprint is, it doesn't come up. And so while a machine is good enough in one situation, kind of gymnastics that it will take to tell the story with this circumstantial evidence. We waived a jury trial in this case with the hope and trust that despite the nature of this evidence, that you could come to a verdict that was not just a way of easing this family's suffering, but it was based on an impartial and honest assessment of the evidence in this case. If that happens and the presumption of innocence is respected, there should not be enough evidence to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ibara is guilty of the crimes charged.
When Judge Patrick Haggard announced the verdict, it was a powerful moment. Ibara was found guilty on all 10 counts, including malice murder, felony murder, and kidnapping with bodily injury.
In the state of Georgia versus Jose Antonio Ibara, count 1, malice murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 2, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 3, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 4, felony murder, I find the defendant guilty. Count 5, kidnapping with bodily injury, I find the defendant guilty. Count 6, aggravated assault with intent to rape, I find the defendant guilty. Count 7, aggravated battery, I find the defendant guilty. Count 8, obstructing or hindering a 911 call, I find the defendant guilty. Count 9, tampering with evidence, I find the defendant guilty. Count 10, peeping Tom, I find the defendant guilty.
I can only imagine the mix of emotions Laken's family must have felt in that moment. Relief that justice was being served, but also the overwhelming grief of knowing nothing could bring her back. For me, hearing that guilty verdict felt like a small victory for Laken, her family, and everyone who loved her. The judge also highlighted the overwhelming nature of the evidence, which left no room for doubt. And that's what stood out to me in this case. The evidence didn't just prove Ibara's guilt, it showed the monstrous nature of his actions. It's hard to fathom how someone could commit such a heinous act. But y'all, justice is bittersweet. Even with the guilty verdict, there's no undoing the pain and loss that Laken's family is enduring. The sentencing hearing was one of the most emotional I've ever seen. Judge Haggard handed down a sentence of life without the possibility of parole for malice murder. He also issued additional consecutive sentences for the other charges, ensuring that Ibara will spend the rest of his life behind bars. I agree 100% with the sentence. Someone who could commit such a calculated and violent act should never have the chance to harm another person. Hearing Laken's family beg for the court to ensure that Ibara could never hurt anyone again, it just reinforced how necessary this sentence was. The judge's remarks before announcing the sentence really struck me. He acknowledged that there's no such thing as closure for the family, and he's right. No sentence, no matter how harsh, can ever fill the void left by Laken's loss. But what the sentence does do is protect others and give Laken's family a small measure of comfort, knowing that Ibara will never be free again. This part of the hearing was the most emotional. Laken's family and friends delivered victim impact statements that painted a vivid picture of who she was and the devastating loss they've endured. Her mom, Allison Phillips, said, "There is no end to the pain and suffering that he inflicted on our family." She described how Laken fought for her life, showing incredible strength even in her final moments. Her sister, Lauren, broke my heart. She talked about how Laken was her biggest role model, her protector, and her best friend. She said, "I now have to tell people I don't have a sibling. Not because she passed away, but because she was brutally murdered." And her best friend, Connolly, shared memories that showed just how kind and selfless Laken was. One story that stuck with me was how Laken woke up at 4:30 a.m. after a nursing clinical to decorate for Connolly's birthday. Y'all, hearing these stories reminded me that behind every victim is a real person. A person who loved and was loved deeply. Laken wasn't just a name in a courtroom. She was somebody's daughter, sister, and best friend. and her family's strength in sharing these memories is nothing short of incredible. This case is one of the most heartbreaking I've ever covered. It's a stark reminder of the evil in this world, but also the incredible love and strength of those left behind. Laken's family made it clear that they will carry her legacy forward, and Ibara's sentence ensures he'll never harm anyone else, but the pain and loss will always be there. Let's take a moment to honor Laken Riley, a young woman with a bright future taken far too soon. Thank you for watching and for remembering Laken with me today. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. How do we protect people like Laken? What more can we do as a society? If you found this video meaningful, please like and subscribe to support the channel. I'll see you in the next one.